Picture the first city in your mind. You're probably seeing walls, right? Massive stone fortifications protecting people inside from enemies outside. Maybe there's a palace where a king sits on a throne, passing judgment. Temples with priests performing rituals. Soldiers marching in formation. Merchants haggling in busy markets. A pyramid of power with rulers at the top and workers at the bottom. That's what cities are. That's what they've always been. Except that's completely wrong. The first cities had no walls, no kings, no palaces, no temples in the way we imagine them. Some of the earliest urban settlements we've discovered operated for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, without any clear evidence of rulers, without hierarchies, without the rigid social structures we assume cities require to function. And the really mind-bending part? Some of these places were built before agriculture even existed, before farming, before anyone figured out how to plant a seed and wait for it to grow. Everything you learned in school about civilization following a neat progression from hunter-gatherers to farmers to city dwellers. It's not exactly false, but it's nowhere near the whole story. The real history of the first cities is so much stranger, so much more fascinating than the clean narrative we've been told. And honestly, most people have no idea just how weird urban life actually began. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's like Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, all at once. There's something beautiful about all of us scattered across the planet, exploring the same ancient mysteries together. Here's the thing that keeps archaeologists up at night. We've found massive stone structures in Turkey that are 11,600 years old, built by people who supposedly had no agriculture, no pottery, no permanent settlements. Just hunter-gatherers who somehow organized themselves to move 100-ton pillars and carve intricate symbols into stone. In central Turkey, there's a settlement where 8,000 people lived, packed together in houses with no streets, no doors, no obvious leaders, and they maintained this bizarre urban experiment for over 1,000 years. In the Indus Valley, we've uncovered cities with sophisticated plumbing and urban planning that make ancient Rome look primitive. Yet we can't find a single palace, a single statue of a ruler, a single piece of evidence that anyone was in charge. These aren't exceptions. These aren't weird outliers. These are some of the most important urban sites in human history, and they completely shatter our assumptions about what cities are supposed to be. The story we've been told goes like this. Humans figured out farming about 10,000 years ago, which created food surpluses, which allowed some people to specialize in other work, which led to trade and social stratification, which eventually required cities with rulers to keep order. It's logical, it's neat, it fits our modern understanding of how complex societies work, but the archaeological evidence keeps refusing to cooperate with this timeline. We keep digging up sites that shouldn't exist according to the conventional narrative. Cities before agriculture, complex monuments before cities, social coordination on a massive scale without any apparent coercion. It's like discovering that someone built a skyscraper before inventing the wheel. What happened? How did urban life actually begin? Why did our ancestors choose to live packed together with thousands of strangers when they could have stayed in small mobile groups? And why do so many of the earlier cities look nothing like what came after? These aren't just academic questions. The way the first cities formed tells us something fundamental about human nature, about what we need to thrive, about what kinds of social arrangements are possible. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of human history doesn't look like what we have now. For thousands of years, people built cities without creating kings. They organized complex societies without police forces. They lived in dense urban environments without developing the hierarchies we assume are necessary for civilization to function. And then, at some point, that changed. Walls appeared. Rulers emerged. armies formed. The question isn't just how cities began. It's why they became what they are today, and whether they had to turn out this way at all. Over the next few hours, we're going to journey back to the very beginning of urban life, to sites so old they make the pyramids look modern, to societies so different from our own that archaeologists still argue about how they functioned, to forgotten experiments in human living that challenge everything we think we know about civilization. The first cities were not what we imagine, not even close. And the truth is so much more interesting than the myth. Before anyone built a city, before anyone even imagined a city, the world had to change in ways that made cities thinkable. Go back 20,000 years, the last glacial maximum, ice sheets 2 miles thick covering Canada and northern Europe, sea levels 400 feet lower than today, coastlines extending for miles beyond where they are now. The entire planet locked in a deep freeze that had lasted for millennia. Your ancestors were there, scattered across the habitable zones in small groups. They weren't struggling exactly. These were the descendants of bottleneck survivors, people whose genetic lineage had been refined by hundreds of thousands of years of crisis management. They knew how to read landscapes, how to predict animal movements, how to find water in impossible places. They had mental maps of territories spanning hundreds of miles, updated yearly through networks of kinship and trade. But they were mobile. They had to be. Resources weren't concentrated enough to support staying in one place year-round. So they moved, following seasonal patterns that had been refined over countless generations. Summer camps near rivers rich with spawning fish. Autumn gathering sites where nut-bearing trees clustered. Winter refuges in caves or constructed shelters where stored foods could see them through the lean months. This wasn't primitive. This was sophisticated. These people knew more about their local ecosystems than most modern humans know about anything. They could identify hundreds of plant species by leaf, flower, seed, and root. They understood animal behavior well enough to predict where herds would be weeks in advance. They had developed stone tool technologies so refined that modern researchers struggle to replicate them. And they had social systems complex enough to maintain cooperation across vast distances. Gift exchange networks that move shells from coastal regions to groups living hundreds of miles inland. Marriage alliances that created kinship bonds between bands that rarely saw each other. Seasonal gatherings where multiple groups would come together to trade, arrange marriages, share information, and probably engage in elaborate ceremonies that reinforce their cultural identity. But nobody stayed put. Not permanently, not yet. Then around 15,000 years ago, something shifted. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in certain regions the ice began its long retreat. And as it melted, it revealed landscapes that were unlike anything humans had seen before. In the Levant, that narrow corridor of land bridging Africa, Europe, and Asia, the climate began warming faster than almost anywhere else. Rainfall increased. Springs that had been dry for millennia began flowing again. And most importantly, certain plants that had been restricted to small refuges during the Ice Age began spreading explosively across the newly hospitable landscape. Wild cereals, wild wheat, wild barley, plants with large, nutritious seeds that grew in dense stands. These weren't domesticated yet, not even close, but they were abundant in ways that fundamentally changed the survival calculus. Here's the thing about wild cereals. They're labor-intensive to harvest, sure. You need specialized tools, baskets, processing equipment, but they provide massive caloric returns. An acre of wild wheat could feed a family for months. And unlike animal prey, which can be overhunted or might migrate away, grain fields stay put. They're there year after year, predictable, reliable, abundant. This created something unprecedented in human history, regions where resources were concentrated enough that moving seemed unnecessary. Why trek 50 miles to the next valley when everything you need is within a day's walk? This is what researchers call the abundance hypothesis. Not that life became easy, but that certain environments became rich enough to support permanent occupation. The rewards of staying put finally outweighed the risks. The Natufian culture emerged in this context around 14,500 years ago. These people weren't farmers yet, they didn't plant seeds or breed animals, but they weren't typical hunter-gatherers either. They were something in between, something new. They built villages. Not seasonal camps, but permanent structures designed to last for generations. Stone foundations supporting walls of wood and reed. Storage pits dug deep into bedrock. Grinding stones so heavy they clearly weren't meant to be transported. These were people committing to place in ways their ancestors never had. Archaeological sites like Ain Malahar show Natufian communities of several hundred people living year-round in the same location. They were harvesting wild cereals with stone sickles, storing surplus grain in plastered pits, and probably engaging in fairly complex systems of food sharing and labour organisation. You can't have 300 people living together without rules about who gets what and who does which work. But even earlier, there were experiments. Ohalo II, near the Sea of Galilee, dates to 23,000 years ago, right in the middle of the last glacial period. It wasn't a city, wasn't even really a village, just a small cluster of brush huts occupied by a single extended family. But they stayed there long enough to leave behind 6 distinct dwelling structures, grinding stones, storage features, and over 140,000 plant remains representing nearly 150 species. They were testing permanence, seeing if staying put could work. Most of these early experiments failed. Groups would settle, stay for a generation or two, then something would go wrong. Resources would decline, conflicts would erupt, disease would strike, the site would be abandoned, people would return to the mobile lifestyles their ancestors had perfected. But each experiment taught lessons. Knowledge accumulated about which locations were most viable, which resources most reliable, which social arrangements most stable. And slowly, very slowly, the psychology shifted. For hundreds of thousands of years, human identity had been tied to movement, to intimate knowledge of vast territories, to the freedom to walk away from problems. Now a different possibility was emerging, the idea of belonging to a specific place, of building something that would last beyond your lifetime, of investing in structures and landscapes that would serve your grandchildren. This required new ways of thinking about property, about resources, about social relationships. When you're mobile, conflicts can be resolved by separation. You just move away from people you don't like. When you're settled, you have to develop more sophisticated conflict resolution systems, mediators, councils, shared rituals that reinforce cooperation. You also have to think about the future differently. Mobile hunter-gatherers think in terms of seasons, maybe years. Settled communities have to think in terms of decades, generations. Plant this tree, and your great-grandchildren will harvest its fruit. Build this house well, and it will shelter your family for a lifetime. The climate was enabling this shift, but also demanding it. The early Holocene, the geological epoch that began around 11,700 years ago, brought warmer temperatures and more stable rainfall patterns to many regions. But it also brought new challenges. As environments became more productive, populations grew. As populations grew, territories became more crowded. The option of simply moving to empty land was slowly disappearing. Some groups responded by intensifying their resource extraction. They harvested more intensively, processed foods more thoroughly, exploited resources they had previously ignored. This intensification created surplus, which created storage problems, which created the need for permanent facilities, which reinforced sedentism. It was a feedback loop. Settling down enabled intensification. Intensification produced surplus. Surplus made settling down more attractive. And with each generation the cycle reinforced itself. But not everyone followed this path. In regions where resources remained dispersed, mobile hunting and gathering remained the optimal strategy for thousands more years. Permanence wasn't inevitable. It was one option among many, one that only made sense under specific environmental and social conditions. The first permanent settlements weren't proto-cities. They were experiments in a radically new way of being human. Most of them would fail, a few would persist. And one, against all odds, would transform into something nobody had ever imagined. Something that would change what it meant to be human forever. September 1994. A Turkish shepherd named Şafak Yıldız is walking across a hilltop in southeastern Anatolia when he notices something odd. A stone sticking up from the soil, but not a natural formation. Too regular, too deliberate. He mentions it to archaeologists surveying the region, and they decide to take a look. What they found would overturn everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization. The site was called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill in Turkish, and buried beneath that unremarkable hillside was a complex that would force archaeologists to rewrite their textbooks, because it shouldn't have existed. Not there, not then, not built by the people who built it. The first excavations revealed massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 15 feet tall and weighing up to 10 tons. They were arranged in circles, multiple circles, each enclosure containing a dozen or more pillars. The pillars weren't crude standing stones. They were precisely carved, their surfaces covered with elaborate reliefs of animals, foxes, lions, bulls, scorpions, serpents, wild boar, gazelles, and birds that archaeologists still struggle to identify. Some pillars show abstract symbols that might be writing, or might be something else entirely. We don't know. But here's what made archaeologists' brains short-circuit. When they dated the site, the results came back impossibly old. 11,600 years. Some structures might be even older, pushing back toward 12,000 years. That's 6,000 years before Stonehenge. 7,000 years before the pyramids. It's from a time when humans weren't supposed to be building anything. Because according to every archaeological timeline, every textbook narrative, every cherished theory about human development, this was impossible. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, no domesticated animals except maybe dogs, no pottery, no metal tools, no permanent settlements that we can find. They were, by all our definitions, primitive, and yet they organized the labor, developed the engineering knowledge, and invested the massive amounts of time necessary to quarry, transport, carve, and erect structures that would have challenged civilizations thousands of years more advanced. Think about what this means. For over a century, archaeologists had a nice clean narrative about human progress. First, we invented agriculture. Agriculture created food surplus. Food surplus allowed some people to specialize in tasks other than food production. Specialists created art, architecture, and eventually cities. Religion came later, after we had the free time and resources to think about such things. It was a logical progression, a story that made sense. Göbekli Tepe says that narrative is backwards. These people built monumental religious architecture first. They created art first. They organized large-scale communal projects first. And then, maybe, possibly, because they were gathering in large numbers at this site, they invented agriculture. The temple came before the farm. The sacred came before the settlement. The logistics alone are staggering. Each of those massive pillars had to be quarried from limestone bedrock using stone tools. Not easy, not quick. Then they had to be transported, probably on log rollers, from the quarry to the hilltop, then erected probably using ramps and ropes and coordinated teams pulling in unison, then carved with those elaborate animal reliefs using nothing but stone chisels and patience. How long does it take to carve a 10-ton pillar with stone tools? Months? Years? And while all this construction was happening, someone had to feed the workers. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, gathering at this site over years or decades. Where did the food come from? The animal bone evidence provides some answers, but also raises more questions. The bones at Göbekli Tepe are overwhelmingly from wild animals, gazelles mostly, but also wild cattle, wild sheep, wild boar. These animals were hunted, butchered, and probably consumed in massive communal feasts. We're not talking about family dinners. We're talking about hundreds of people gathering to share massive quantities of meat. Some of the animal bones show signs of careful processing, marrow extraction, systematic butchering, even possible ritual treatment. There are cut marks in places that suggest the removal of meat for display rather than consumption. Were they creating some kind of ceremonial offering, leaving portions for gods or spirits, or just showing off the success of the hunt? But here's what really challenges our understanding. Coordinating these feasts required planning on a scale we didn't think hunter-gatherers were capable of. Someone had to organize the hunts. Someone had to coordinate the timing so that multiple groups arrived at the same time. Someone had to manage the food distribution. Someone had to make sure there was enough to go around. This implies hierarchies, specialized roles, probably some form of leadership structure that could maintain authority over groups coming from different territories. And the site kept growing. Over the centuries they built more enclosures, each one slightly different, each one with its own arrangement of pillars and its own unique carvings. Then, strangest of all, they deliberately buried them. Not abandoning them to decay naturally, but carefully filling in the enclosures with rubble and soil, preserving them perfectly for archaeologists 11,000 years later. Then they'd build a new enclosure on top. Layer after layer, generation after generation, this process continued for over 1,000 years. Why? Why would they bury perfectly functional structures? Some archaeologists think it was ritual, each generation creating their own sacred space, then deliberately entombing it before starting fresh. Others think the buried enclosures were becoming spiritually exhausted or polluted and needed to be sealed away. Still others suggest the burial was protective, preserving the structures for some future purpose we can't fathom. The animal carvings add another layer of mystery. They're not random. There are patterns. Predators often face each other. Some animals appear on specific pillars in specific enclosures. Certain symbols recur across multiple structures. Archaeologists have spent decades trying to decode what it all means. Are they totem animals representing different clans or groups? Are they a form of proto-writing? Symbols conveying information we can no longer read? Are they mythological, representing stories and beliefs that died out millennia ago? One theory suggests Göbekli Tepe was an astronomical observatory. Some of the animal symbols might represent constellations. The arrangement of pillars might align with celestial events. There's evidence that some structures were oriented towards specific stellar or solar positions. But the evidence is ambiguous. Ancient people were certainly aware of the sky, tracking seasons and celestial cycles. Whether Göbekli Tepe was systematically recording these observations or simply incorporating them into religious architecture remains unclear. Another theory positions it as a pilgrimage site, a sacred centre where groups from across the region gathered periodically for ceremonies, feasts, and social bonding. The lack of permanent dwellings nearby supports this. People came, participated in whatever rituals or gatherings occurred, then returned to their territories. The massive investment in monumental architecture makes sense if the site was culturally central to multiple communities. Building impressive structures would demonstrate devotion, strengthen group identity, and create a shared sacred landscape. But maybe the most radical interpretation is that Göbekli Tepe was a school, not in the modern sense, but a place where knowledge was transmitted, where master craftsmen taught apprentices how to carve stone, where spiritual leaders passed down oral traditions, where different groups exchanged information about resources, hunting territories, tool-making techniques. The investment in creating such elaborate structures might have been educational, each generation learning by doing, preserving, and passing on skills through the very act of construction. What we do know is that Göbekli Tepe wasn't unique. In the decades since its discovery, archaeologists have found similar sites across the region. Karahan Tepe, discovered in 1997 but only seriously excavated in recent years, features similar T-shaped pillars and elaborate carvings. It might be even older than Göbekli Tepe. There's also Nevalachori, now flooded by a dam but excavated before its destruction, which showed similar architectural features. Sefer Tepe, Hamzan Tepe, Harbetsavan Tepesi, the list keeps growing. It's becoming clear that Göbekli Tepe wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was part of a broader cultural complex, a network of ceremonial sites spread across what is now southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. These weren't competing centres, but interconnected parts of a shared religious or social system. Groups from across the region participated in building and maintaining multiple sites. The scale of cooperation and coordination this implies is breathtaking. And here's the kicker. This region, this network of ceremonial sites, sits right on top of what archaeologists call the Neolithic package. The wild ancestors of wheat, barley, lentils and chickpeas all grew naturally in the hills surrounding Göbekli Tepe. Wild sheep, goats, cattle and pigs all roam these same territories. This is where agriculture began. Within a few thousand years of Göbekli Tepe's construction, people in this exact region would domesticate these plants and animals, launching the Neolithic revolution that would transform human existence. Coincidence? Maybe. But many archaeologists now think the connection is direct. The massive gatherings at Göbekli Tepe and similar sites would have concentrated human populations in ways that never happened before. More people meant more pressure on wild resources. More pressure meant experimenting with new ways to increase food production. And those wild grasses growing on the hillsides, someone would have noticed that the seeds were edible. Someone would have tried planting them deliberately. Someone would have started selecting the largest seeds, the easiest to harvest, gradually transforming wild plants into domesticated crops. The ceremonial centre created the conditions for agricultural experimentation. Religion, in a very real sense, might have given birth to farming. Not because priests commanded it, but because gathering for spiritual purposes created the practical necessity for new food production strategies. But that's speculation. What's not speculation is that Göbekli Tepe proves our ancestors were capable of things we never imagined. These weren't simple hunter-gatherers living hand-to-mouth, just struggling to survive. They were sophisticated people with complex social organizations, advanced engineering knowledge, artistic sensibilities, and spiritual beliefs elaborate enough to justify decades of back-breaking construction work. They were us, just without agriculture, without cities, without any of the things we thought were necessary for civilization, and they were building temples. Around 7,400 BC, in the flat plains of central Turkey, something unprecedented was taking shape. Not a temple complex like Göbekli Tepe, not a village that served a ceremonial centre, but an actual city. Except it looked like nothing we would recognize as urban. Çatalhöyük. The name means, quote, zero in Turkish, which tells you nothing about what archaeologists found when they started digging into this settlement in the 1960s. What they discovered was a place where up to 8,000 people lived, pressed together in a honeycomb of identical mud brick houses, a place that had been continuously occupied for nearly 2,000 years, a a place that shouldn't have been possible according to everything we thought we knew about how human societies scale up. Because Çatalhöyük had no streets, none, no alleyways, no public squares, no marketplace, no temple district, just houses. Hundreds upon hundreds of rectangular mud brick houses packed so tightly together that their walls literally touched, creating a continuous surface. The entire settlement was essentially one massive building complex, and the roofs were the streets. Think about what that means for a moment. You're living in Çatalhöyük 9,000 years ago. You wake up in the morning. To leave your house, you don't open a door onto a street. You climb a ladder through a hole in your roof. You emerge onto the flat roof of your home, which is also the floor of your neighborhood. Around you spread hundreds of similar roofs, creating an artificial landscape of compacted mud that you can walk across for hundreds of meters in any direction. Somewhere nearby, maybe 10 houses over, smoke rises from another roof entrance where your neighbor's family is cooking breakfast. To visit that neighbor, you walk across the rooftops until you reach their entrance, then climb down their ladder into their house. The entire city functioned this way. Movement happened above ground level. Everything important happened below, in the cool, dark interiors where families lived, worked, cooked, and buried their dead. Yes, buried their dead. Because Çatalhöyük had another peculiarity that makes modern archaeologists slightly uncomfortable. The people who lived there didn't bury their dead in cemeteries outside the settlement. They buried them beneath the floors of their houses, right under where they slept, cooked, and raised children. Not just one or two ancestors, multiple generations. Some houses have been found with dozens of burials beneath their floors, creating layers of bones that span centuries, and the residents didn't just bury and forget. They dug up the skulls. They plastered them with clay to recreate facial features. They painted them. They kept them in their homes, probably in special niches in the walls, living quite literally with the faces of their grandparents and great-grandparents watching over them. This wasn't some primitive superstition. This was a sophisticated ancestor cult, a religious system that bound families to specific houses, specific pieces of ground, specific lineages stretching back generations. When you lived in Çatalhöyük, your house wasn't just shelter. It was a shrine to your family's history, a physical connection to every ancestor who had lived and died in that exact spot. The archaeological evidence suggests people rebuilt their houses on the same foundations over and over. When a house got too old or began to collapse, the family would carefully demolish the upper walls, fill the interior with clean dirt to create a platform, then build a new house on top of the old one. The floor plan remained identical. The hearth went in the same place. The sleeping platforms occupied the same positions. Even the decorations often mimicked the house below. Generation after generation, century after century, families maintained their connection to ancestral space with obsessive precision. And those decorations. The interior walls of Çatalhöyük houses were covered in art. Not occasional decoration, but elaborate painted murals and three-dimensional plaster reliefs that covered entire walls. Leopards rendered in spotted ochre, their bodies tense with predatory energy. Massive bulls with spreading horns. Vultures with naked heads circling over headless human corpses. Human-like figures with arms and legs spread wide, possibly shamans or deities. Some of the most striking images show rows of breasts with animal skulls emerging from them, plaster reliefs that might represent a mother goddess or fertility cult. Others display complex geometric patterns, networks of interlocking shapes that might have had symbolic or ritual meaning we can no longer decipher. This wasn't public art. These murals were inside private homes, visible only to family members and invited guests, which raises fascinating questions. Was each household conducting its own religious rituals? Did families compete to create the most elaborate decorations? Or was this art serving some other purpose entirely? perhaps marking lineage affiliations or recording historical events. We don't know. The people of Çatalhöyük left no writing, no obvious hierarchy of priests to interpret for us, just the art itself and the archaeological layers that preserve 9 millennia of daily life. What those layers tell us is even stranger than the roofless architecture or the ancestor burials. They tell us Çatalhöyük was a city of equals, not perfect equality, not some ancient communist utopia, but something remarkably close to it. The houses are all basically the same size, roughly 25 square meters. No palaces, no mansions with extra rooms for servants or storage. No obvious concentration of wealth in any particular area. The burials show similar patterns. No royal tombs loaded with gold and precious goods. No warrior elites buried with weapons and armor. Just people, men and women and children, interred beneath their family floors with modest grave goods. Maybe some beads, some stone tools, occasionally a special piece of obsidian. The diet was similar across the settlement. Everyone ate the same foods, wheat and barley cultivated in fields outside the city, lentils and peas, some wild game hunted in the surrounding plains. Analysis of human remains shows no significant differences in nutrition between individuals, no evidence of a class that ate better than everyone else. Even the manufacturing showed little specialization. Most families seem to have produced their own stone tools, woven their own textiles, made their own pottery. There were some specialists, people particularly skilled at working obsidian or creating the fine clay figurines that Çatalhöyük residents seem to love. But these specialists lived in the same houses as everyone else, were buried the same way, showed no obvious markers of elevated status. For archaeologists trained on Mesopotamian cities with their massive temples and royal palaces, on Egyptian settlements dominated by monuments to divine kings, Çatalhöyük was profoundly disorienting. Here was a city of thousands, sustained for nearly 2 millennia, that showed no evidence of the hierarchy everyone assumed was necessary for urban life. So how did it work? How did 8,000 people coordinate without chiefs or administrators or priests commanding from temples? The answer seems to be the houses themselves. Those densely packed, roof-entered, ancestor-filled houses weren't just dwellings. They were the basic unit of social organization. Each house represented a lineage, a family line extending back generations. The families maintained their own food stores, conducted their own rituals, decorated their own walls, buried their own dead. They were largely self-sufficient, but they were also embedded in a network. Neighbors shared rooftop space. Multiple families cooperated to maintain the mud brick surfaces everyone walked on. They worked together during the harvest. They probably exchanged marriage partners, creating kinship ties that linked houses across the settlement. The uniformity of house size and burial practices suggests powerful social norms, unwritten rules about equality that everyone understood and enforced. This was governance by consensus and custom, not by command. No one could force you to do anything because no one had concentrated enough power. But everyone was watched by everyone else. Deviate too much from community norms, build your house too large, claim too much status, and you'd face social consequences. Gossip, ostracism, the loss of cooperation that your family needed to survive. It was a fragile balance, and it required something that may be impossible in larger societies. It required that everyone more or less knew everyone else, that reputation and social pressure could maintain order without formal institutions. But it worked. For nearly 2,000 years, through climate fluctuations and population growth and technological changes, Çatalhöyük persisted. Generation after generation chose to maintain the egalitarian system, to rebuild their houses on ancestral foundations, to continue living pressed together without streets or chiefs or temples, until, around 5,700 BC, they didn't. The settlement wasn't destroyed. There's no evidence of conquest or catastrophic fire. The population just gradually declined. Families stopped rebuilding. The carefully maintained roof surfaces began to collapse. Within a few generations, Çatalhöyük was abandoned. The mud brick houses slowly dissolved back into the Turkish plain, leaving only the mound that would puzzle archaeologists 7,000 years later. Why? What made thousands of people abandon a system that had worked for 2 millennia? We don't know. Climate change might have made the local environment less productive. Population pressure might have strained the egalitarian system past its breaking point. Maybe the residents simply chose to disperse to new settlements where they could try different social arrangements. Or maybe maintaining equality had become too exhausting. Maybe after 2,000 years, people were tired of living in identical houses, tired of the constant social monitoring that prevented anyone from accumulating too much, tired of entering their homes through roof hatches when the technology to build streets and doors had long been available. Whatever the reason, Çatalhöyük's experiment ended, and the future of cities would look very different. Hierarchy was coming. Chiefs and priests and kings who could command rather than persuade. Monuments that would dwarf any private home. Social systems that would create vast gaps between rich and poor. But for 2 millennia, thousands of people had proven that another way was possible, that cities didn't require rulers, that urban life could be organized around equality rather than domination, that the first cities were not in fact what we imagine at all. So far, every human settlement we've looked at has been fundamentally egalitarian. Göbekli Tepe's builders dispersed after their ceremonies. Çatalhöyük's residents entered their houses through the roof because apparently streets and social stratification were both equally unnecessary. These weren't just quirks of architecture. They were expressions of a deep human preference for autonomy, for living together without living under anyone. But something changed in southern Mesopotamia. Something that would create the template for almost every civilization that came after. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We still don't fully understand why humans accepted it. Why did people who had lived for thousands of years without kings suddenly bow to them? Why did societies that functioned perfectly well without hierarchies build ziggurats to lords and masters? The answers aren't simple, and they're not particularly reassuring. Around 5,400 BCE, people started moving into the marshy plains of southern Iraq. This wasn't prime real estate. Not like the northern hills with their reliable rainfall and fertile soil. The south was hot, flat, and unpredictable. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded violently in spring, then dwindled to muddy trickles in summer. Natural resources were scarce. No timber, no stone, barely any metal, just reeds, mud, and the searing sun. But it had one crucial advantage: agricultural potential, if you could control the water. And that, quote one, turned out to be the hinge on which human social organization would turn. The first southern settlements were tiny, little clusters of reed houses built on whatever high ground the marsh offered. One of the earliest was Eridu, established around 5,400 BCE. Archaeological layers at Eridu show something fascinating. From its very beginning there was a temple, not a big one, just a small shrine, maybe 12 feet square, built on a platform. But here's what's strange. That temple got rebuilt. Again and again and again. Each time slightly larger, slightly more elaborate, always in exactly the same spot. Over the next 2,000 years, that original tiny shrine would grow into a massive complex. The people of Eridu would tear down the old temple and build a new one directly on top of it, creating layers of sacred architecture that archaeologists can still trace today. 18 different temple levels, one on top of another, like a religious layer cake baked over millennia. This tells us something profound: continuity of belief. The people of Eridu weren't just building temples, They were maintaining a sacred connection to a specific place, passing that devotion down through hundreds of generations. The gods lived there, the gods had always lived there, and someone had to maintain the god's house. That someone was a priest, or probably multiple priests, and those priests needed to be fed, housed, and supplied with everything necessary to perform their sacred duties, which meant other people had to support them, not through occasional gifts like at Göbekli Tepe, but through systematic, regular contributions. This was new. This was the beginning of permanent specialized roles. People who didn't grow their own food but were fed by the community in exchange for their services. But the real transformation happened at Uruk. Around 4000 BCE, Uruk began growing. Not slowly, not gradually, but explosively. Within a few centuries it had ballooned into something the world had never seen before. A city of perhaps 40,000 people, possibly more, the first true metropolis. To understand how extraordinary this was, you need context. Çatalhöyük at its height maybe had 8,000 residents, and that was considered massive. Most settlements were a few hundred people. But Uruk was different by orders of magnitude. It covered nearly 2.5 square miles. It had monumental architecture that dwarfed anything built before. And most importantly, it had something that all those earlier settlements lacked: visible, unmistakable social hierarchy. The evidence is everywhere, in the massive temple complexes that dominated the city centre, in the standardized housing that shows clear distinctions between elite residences and workers' quarters, in the workshops producing luxury goods that only some people could have afforded, in the fortification walls that required coordinating thousands of labourers, and in the tablets. Oh, those tablets. Around 3200 BCE, someone in Uruk made a mark on a clay tablet that would change human history forever. Not a decoration, not art, an accounting record, a note about grain deliveries or livestock distributions. We call it writing, but it wasn't what we imagine. These weren't poems or prayers, they were receipts. The earliest writing was purely administrative. Symbols representing commodities, grain, beer, sheep, cattle, numbers indicating quantities, names or signs indicating recipients or responsible officials. That's it. For centuries, that's all writing was used for. Bureaucracy, control, keeping track of who owed what to whom. Think about what that means. Writing didn't emerge from a desire to record history or express ideas. It emerged from the need to manage complexity, to track the enormous quantities of goods flowing into temples and redistributed to workers, to maintain records across years and administrations, to create accountability in an increasingly stratified system. Because that's what Uruk was becoming. Stratified. The archaeological evidence shows distinct social classes emerging. At the top, a priestly elite who controlled the temple complexes and their enormous stores of wealth. Below them, skilled craftsmen, potters, weavers, metal workers, each specializing in a single trade. Below them, agricultural workers who grew the food. And below them, laborers who did the hard, dirty work of building and maintaining the city's infrastructure. This wasn't subtle. Elite burials from this period contain jewellery, fine ceramics and elaborate grave goods. Common burials contain almost nothing. The difference isn't just visible, it's stark, proclamative. Some people had wealth and status. Others had neither. But why? Why did people accept this? Why didn't they just leave, like the builders of Göbekli Tepe did after each gathering? Why stay and work for people who clearly controlled more resources and wielded more power? The traditional answer involves irrigation. Southern Mesopotamia's agricultural productivity depended on controlling floodwaters through canals, dikes, and reservoirs. These systems required coordination, maintenance, and defense. Someone had to organize the labor. Someone had to allocate water rights. Someone had to settle disputes. That someone became powerful because everyone depended on the system they managed. This theory, sometimes called hydraulic despotism, makes intuitive sense. Complex irrigation requires centralized management, which concentrates power, which creates hierarchy. Problem solved. Except the evidence doesn't quite support it. Early irrigation systems in southern Mesopotamia were relatively simple. Small-scale canals managed by individual villages. The massive regional systems came later, after the hierarchies were already established. The big irrigation projects seem to be consequences of centralized power, not causes. So what else? Another theory emphasizes warfare. As populations grew and resources became contested, settlements needed defense. Walls, weapons, coordinated fighting forces. Military leadership naturally creates hierarchy. The successful war leader accumulates prestige, then power, then permanent authority. His descendants become an aristocracy. There's evidence for this too. Uruk and other early Mesopotamian cities built impressive fortifications. Cylinder seals from the period show battle scenes with clear leaders commanding troops. Later Mesopotamian texts are obsessed with military conquest, but again, the timeline is fuzzy. Were the hierarchies creating armies, or were the armies creating hierarchies? The third explanation is ideological. Maybe people accepted hierarchy because they were convinced it was necessary, that the gods demanded it. That cosmic order required earthly reflection. The king wasn't just a powerful man. He was the god's representative, the bridge between heaven and earth. To obey him was to obey divine will. The temple complexes at Uruk certainly suggest this interpretation. These weren't just administrative centers. They were sacred spaces of overwhelming grandeur. The White Temple of Uruk sat atop a massive platform called a ziggurat, visible from miles away. To approach it, you ascended steep staircases, passed through elaborately decorated gates, entered courtyards designed to dwarf human scale. This was architecture as ideology. It said, "The gods are vast and we are small. The gods' servants, the priests, therefore deserve our obedience and our labor. The system they manage isn't just practical, it's sacred." And maybe that's closest to the truth. Maybe hierarchy wasn't imposed from above or accepted from below. Maybe it emerged from the complex interaction of practical needs, military pressures, and ideological frameworks that made inequality seem not just inevitable, but cosmically ordained. But here's what we know for certain. Hierarchy came with costs. Disease spread faster in dense urban populations. Skeletal remains from early Mesopotamian cities show higher rates of malnutrition, infectious disease, and traumatic injuries than earlier settlements. Life expectancy probably dropped. Childhood mortality certainly increased. Inequality created new forms of violence. Not just warfare between cities, but structural violence within them. People working until their bodies broke. Debt slavery. Punishment systems that grew increasingly elaborate and cruel. Later Mesopotamian law codes specify gruesome penalties for various offences, all were scaled according to social class. The same crime that earned an elite person a fine would earn a commoner physical mutilation. And yet people stayed. Uruk thrived. Other cities followed its template: Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kish. By 3000 BCE, southern Mesopotamia was an urban landscape. Dozens of cities linked by trade networks, competing for resources, developing increasingly sophisticated technologies and social systems. They were creating civilization, all the things we associate with that word: writing, mathematics, law codes, professional armies, monumental architecture, complex religion, administrative bureaucracies. But they were also creating its shadow: poverty, slavery, warfare, epidemic disease, environmental degradation. These weren't separate developments. They were intrinsically linked. You can't have the bronze without the mines that exhausted workers extracted it from. You can't have the temples without the labourers who built them. You can't have the kings without the subjects who obeyed them. And once it started, it couldn't be stopped. The next 5,000 years would see variations on this template spread across the world. Different cultures, different environments, but the same basic pattern. Cities, hierarchies, states. Mesopotamia had shown that it was possible, had shown that it worked, at least for those at the top. The question that haunts us, was it inevitable? Or did Mesopotamia simply make a choice that others then felt compelled to follow? While Mesopotamian kings were building ziggurats and Egyptian pharaohs were commissioning pyramids, something completely different was happening in the Indus Valley. Cities were rising that would challenge everything we think we know about how urban civilization works. Cities without apparent rulers, cities without temples or palaces, cities that organize themselves according to principles so foreign to our understanding that, even after a century of excavation, we still can't figure out how they functioned. Picture Mohenjo-Daro around 2500 BCE. You're standing at the edge of a city that houses maybe 40,000 people, possibly more. But this isn't like anything you've seen in Mesopotamia or Egypt. There are no massive monuments dominating the skyline, no palace compound with towering walls announcing the presence of a god-king, no temple complex where priests perform elaborate rituals to invisible deities. Instead, what you see is order. Perfect, almost unsettling order. The streets run in precise grid patterns, oriented to catch the prevailing winds. Not approximate grids like you might achieve through casual planning, but geometrically exact layouts that required sophisticated surveying and centralized coordination. Major thoroughfares run perfectly straight for hundreds of meters, wide enough for 2 carts to pass comfortably. Smaller streets branch off at right angles, creating city blocks of remarkably uniform size. Every building, every wall, every structure in the city is made from bricks of identical dimensions. Not roughly similar bricks, but standardized units produced to exact specifications. The ratio of length to width to height is consistent across the entire city, across the entire civilization actually. You can take a brick from Mohenjo-Daro and it will match perfectly with bricks from Harappa, 400 miles to the northeast, or from Dolavira, 450 miles to the southeast. This is mass production and standardization on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. But the really remarkable thing, the thing that makes archaeologists shake their heads in bewilderment, is the drainage system. Every house, even modest homes in working-class neighborhoods, connects to an underground sewage network. Covered drains run beneath the streets, carrying waste away from residential areas. Inspection holes are placed at regular intervals for maintenance. The entire system is designed with gradients that ensure proper flow without pumping. This is urban infrastructure that most cities in the medieval world couldn't match. Some Victorian-era cities had worse sanitation than Mohenjo-Daro in 2500 BCE. Walk through the streets and you notice something else unusual. The houses are remarkably similar in size. There are larger homes and smaller ones, certainly, but nothing like the massive disparities you see in Mesopotamian cities where elite compounds dwarf the hovels of common workers. No palatial estates proclaiming the wealth and power of their owners. Just street after street of solid, well-built homes with private wells, bathing platforms and waste disposal systems. The uniformity extends to what's missing. No weapons. Indus Valley cities have produced thousands of artifacts, everything from children's toys to merchants' weights, but almost no weapons, no bronze swords, no spearheads beyond what you'd use for hunting, no depictions of warfare, no fortifications, no evidence of military institutions at all. For a civilization that lasted 700 years and encompassed an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, this absence is extraordinary. These people traded with Mesopotamia, where warfare was constant. They knew weapons existed. They just apparently decided not to make them central to their society. Then there's the structure that really confuses everyone. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro. It's a massive public facility, about 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, built with waterproof bricks sealed with natural tar. Steps lead down into the water on both ends. Smaller rooms surround it, possibly for changing or private bathing. The whole complex sits on a raised platform in the centre of the city, suggesting it was important, possibly sacred. But we have no idea what it was for. Ritual purification? Public bathing? Some ceremony we can't even imagine? There are no inscriptions explaining its purpose, no art depicting its use, just this beautifully engineered pool that clearly mattered a great deal to the people who built it, for reasons that remain completely mysterious. And that's the frustrating thing about the Indus Valley civilization. Everything is there, perfectly preserved by the dry climate, but nothing explains itself. We have their cities, their tools, their seals, their weights and measures. We have evidence of their trade network stretching from Afghanistan to the Persian Gulf. But we can't read their writing, we don't know their language, and we can't identify their rulers or understand their political system. The script is particularly maddening. Over 4,000 inscribed objects have been recovered, mostly small seals used for marking trade goods. The symbols are clearly writing, not just decorative designs. They're too systematic, too consistently structured. But the inscriptions are all frustratingly short, usually just a few symbols. The longest known text is only 26 characters. It's like trying to understand English literature by reading nothing but shipping labels. You might figure out some basic vocabulary, but you'd miss everything about grammar, syntax, and meaning. Without a bilingual inscription, without longer texts, without anything to provide context, the Indus script remains one of archaeology's great unsolved mysteries. What we can figure out from those seals is that trade mattered enormously to Indus Valley society. The seals depict animals, some real and some fantastical. Bulls, elephants, tigers, rhinoceroses, creatures that suggest the Indus people lived in close relationship with a diverse and abundant natural world. The seals were used to mark goods, identifying their origin or owner. Impressions of these seals have been found as far west as Mesopotamia, evidence of trade networks spanning thousands of miles. Indus merchants were shipping carnelian beads, cotton textiles, and precious stones to Mesopotamian cities. They were importing copper and tin, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, turquoise from Iran. They had developed standardized systems of weights and measures that facilitated this trade. Every Indus city used the same weight system, based on ratios that were consistent across the entire civilization. But here's what's remarkable. Unlike Mesopotamian trade, which was controlled by temple complexes and palaces, Indus Valley commerce seems to have operated through different mechanisms. There are no central warehouses, no obvious administrative buildings where trade would be regulated. The uniform weights suggest coordination, but the absence of palaces suggests that coordination happened through consensus rather than command. Some archaeologists think merchant councils ran these cities, groups of successful traders who met to establish standards and resolve disputes, but who didn't concentrate power in permanent hierarchies. Others suggest priest-kings, religious leaders who wielded authority through spiritual rather than military power. But there's no archaeological evidence for either theory. No council chambers, no religious iconography depicting priest-kings performing ceremonies. The most radical suggestion is that Indus cities were organized through some form of collective decision-making we can't quite conceptualize. that they developed urban institutions fundamentally different from the hierarchical systems that emerged in Mesopotamia and Egypt, that they proved, for 700 years, that cities could function through cooperation rather than coercion. But we're speculating, reading our hopes and theories into an archaeological record that refuses to provide clear answers. What we do know is that around 1900 BCE something went wrong. The cities began to decline, not suddenly, not catastrophically, but gradually, inexorably, like a clock winding down. Construction quality decreased. The careful urban planning gave way to haphazard building. The drainage system fell into disrepair. Population declined. By 1300 BCE, the great cities were abandoned. Mohenjo-Daro empty. Harappa reduced to a small village. The entire urban network that had sustained millions of people across 500,000 square miles simply dissolved. What happened? The traditional theory blamed invasion, Aryan peoples from the north sweeping down to conquer the peaceful Indus Valley dwellers. But there's no archaeological evidence for that. No destruction layers, no mass graves, no sudden appearance of new cultural materials. The invasion theory is now largely discredited, revealed as more colonial mythology than historical fact. Climate change is a better explanation, but it's complicated. The Indus Valley civilization depended on the monsoon rains and the rivers fed by Himalayan snowmelt. Around 2000 BCE, the monsoon patterns began shifting. Rainfall became less reliable. Some rivers changed course, leaving cities without water. The Gaga-Hakra river system, which may have been the mighty Sarasvati mentioned in ancient texts, dried up entirely. But climate change doesn't explain everything. Other civilizations faced climate challenges and adapted. Mesopotamian cities dealt with droughts by intensifying irrigation. Egyptian cities survived Nile flood failures through storage and redistribution. Why couldn't the Indus cities adapt? Maybe it was the very thing that made them successful that also made them fragile. The standardization, the careful planning, the elaborate infrastructure all required maintenance and coordination. When the environmental conditions shifted, when rivers changed course and rainfall patterns altered, the rigid system couldn't adjust fast enough. Or maybe the absence of strong central authority, if that's what really existed, meant there was no mechanism to organize large-scale responses to crisis. Merchant councils and collective decision-making work well in stable conditions, but perhaps they couldn't mobilize resources quickly enough when everything started falling apart. We'll probably never know for certain. The Indus Valley civilization guards its secrets too well. What we're left with is the tantalizing possibility that humanity tried a different experiment in urban living, that for 700 years people built cities without kings, organized trade without empires, and maintained sophisticated infrastructure through cooperation rather than coercion. And then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, that experiment ended and those cities returned to dust, carrying their secrets with them into silence. When most people picture ancient Egypt, they don't see cities at all. They see stone, a horizon of pyramids rising out of the desert, gigantic statues staring over empty sands, temples carved with lines of hieroglyphs nobody could read for thousands of years. It's easy to imagine Egypt as a land of monuments, not neighborhoods, a civilization of god-kings and tombs, not streets and courtyards and cooking fires. But that image is a trick of survival. Stone pyramids and rock-cut tombs endure for 4,500 years. Mud brick houses, wooden doors, reed mats, and narrow lanes do not. So when you stand in front of a pyramid today, it feels like the past was all about this one giant triangle of stone, and not about the thousands of people who lived, argued, flirted, complained about their bosses, and raised children in its shadow. To find those people, you have to look away from the famous monuments and follow the river that made all of it possible, the Nile. For most of Egypt's history, The Nile wasn't just a river. It was the calendar, the highway, the pantry, and the spine of the entire country. Every year, usually between July and October, it rose out of its banks and spread dark, fertile silt across the floodplain. Then the waters slowly retreated, leaving behind a long, narrow ribbon of black earth in the middle of an ocean of desert. If you were going to build a city here, you had to think like the river. You couldn't just plant your houses anywhere. Too close to the water, and the floods would tear them apart. Too far into the desert, and you'd be hauling water and mud every day just to stay alive. So early Egyptian settlements learned to cling to the slightly higher ground along the river, perched just above the annual flood line, close enough to use the water, far enough not to drown in it. This created a kind of linear civilization. Instead of sprawling out in every direction like Mesopotamian cities, Egyptian towns tended to stretch along the Nile's banks. From above, it would have looked like a bright green band of life snaking through a lifeless yellow world, with clusters of houses and shrines and storage granaries hanging onto it like beads on a cord. Long before the pyramids, some of those beads began to swell into something more. One of the most important was a place the Egyptians called Nekhen. Today we know it as Hierakonpolis. 5,000 years ago, Hierakonpolis was one of the largest settlements in Upper Egypt, a cluster of mud brick houses, workshops, and ritual spaces on the west bank of the Nile. It didn't look like a city in the way we might imagine, with straight streets and stone walls. It was more fluid, more organic, a collection of neighborhoods adapting to the shifting edges of the floodplain. But it was powerful. Archaeologists have found elite burials there with painted pottery, imported goods, and elaborate grave goods that hint at early kingship. They've uncovered evidence of breweries capable of producing thousands of litres of beer at a time, massive slaughter areas where animals were processed on an industrial scale, and ritual objects like the famous Nama palette, which seems to celebrate the unification of Egypt under a single ruler. If Mesopotamia's city-states fought each other into exhaustion, Egypt seems to have stumbled earlier than most into something different. One river, one kingdom, one pharaoh. Places like Hierakonpolis may have been laboratories for that experiment. Here, on a thin strip of habitable land pressed between desert cliffs and the Nile, emerging elites practiced the art of organizing labor at a large scale, collecting surplus from farmers, directing craft production, and staging rituals that turned political power into something sacred. From this competition and consolidation, Egypt eventually unified around 3100 BCE. The king was no longer just a local strongman. He became a cosmic figure, the mediator between the gods, the river, and the people, and once that happened, the relationship between cities and power shifted again. Unlike in Mesopotamia, where cities like Ur and Uruk were independent powers, Egyptian cities were often satellites of something even larger, the institution of kingship itself. Memphis, for example, rises out of this moment. Founded near the apex of the Nile Delta, not far from where Upper and Lower Egypt meet, Memphis occupied a strategic position, a kind of hinge between north and south, between the many channels of the delta and the single ribbon of the river upstream. For much of Egypt's early history, Memphis served as a royal capital, a place where scribes, priests, craftsmen, and officials clustered around the king's court. But the city itself is almost invisible today, its mud brick houses melted back into the soil long ago. What survives are the tombs and pyramids built in its desert cemeteries, Saqqara, Giza, Dahshur. So Memphis is known to us not by its living streets, but by its cities of the dead. The same pattern haunts Thebes. When you hear Thebes, you might think of colossal columns, hypostyle halls, towering obelisks, the temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor stretching for kilometers along the Nile, and they were monumental. They were meant to be. New Kingdom pharaohs poured wealth and labor into these temples, turning Thebes into a landscape of stone theology. Every wall, every inscription, every colossal statue was part of a cosmic performance. The king feeding the gods blessing the land, the Nile rising on cue. But again, the actual city, the shops, the bakeries, the beer houses, the courtyards where children played, almost all of that has disappeared. To glimpse that world, you have to look at places that were never meant to be eternal. One of the best preserved is a small village tucked into a desert valley on the west bank of the Nile, across from Thebes, Deir el-Medina. On a modern map it's tiny, just a cluster of houses enclosed by a wall, a little rectangle of stone and mud surrounded by barren hills. Yet the people who lived here left behind one of the richest archives of everyday life from the ancient world. Deir el-Medina was a workers' village. Its inhabitants were specialized craftsmen, stonecutters, painters, carpenters, responsible for digging and decorating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They were state employees, paid in rations of grain, beer and other goods. They were literate at rates that would have been unthinkable for most ancient communities. And they wrote almost everything down. On scraps of limestone and broken pottery, they recorded letters, complaints, love poems, prayers, legal disputes, and even the earliest known record of a strike. When their rations were delayed, the workers of Deir el-Medina simply stopped going to the tombs, sat down in the temple precincts, and waited until officials came to negotiate. This is a very different picture of ancient Egypt than rows of silent labourers hauling stones under the whip. The archaeological and textual record from places like Deir el-Medina suggests complex labour organisation, with foremen, scribes, ration systems, and channels for grievances. Not always fair, not always gentle, but far from purely coercive. There are hints of social mobility too. Some workers came from families that had held these skilled positions for generations. Others seem to have risen from less privileged backgrounds, leveraging literacy, talent or patronage to secure a place in this relatively well-paid, relatively comfortable enclave. Widows could inherit property. Women participated in legal proceedings, owned goods, and sometimes held religious roles. Slavery existed, but the overall system of labour was more varied than a simple top-down command. And yet, all of this ordinary life unfolded literally in the shadow of pharaonic power. Look again at the map. On the east bank, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, presenting Thebes to the living world. On the west bank, the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs tried to secure their place in eternity. Between them, the Nile, performing its yearly miracle, rising and falling like a steady breath. In this landscape, cities were never just concentrations of people, they were instruments. Memphis, Thebes, and later cities like Akhetaten were built, or reshaped, to project divine authority. Akhetaten especially feels like a thought experiment written in stone. Around 1350 BCE, the pharaoh Akhenaten did something unprecedented. He turned away from the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods and elevated a single deity, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun. Then he built a new city for this new vision. Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, rose on a virgin stretch of desert, far from the old religious centres. In just a few years, thousands of workers laid out temples, palaces, houses, and administrative buildings in a planned pattern, stretching along a wide curve of the Nile. Unlike the slowly grown towns that hug the floodplain, Akhetaten was imposed almost all at once. A royal decree turned into urban form. Processional roads cut straight lines through the city. Open courtyards and roofless temples were designed to let the sun's rays, the Aten's light, fall directly on the offerings. Residential quarters housed officials, craftsmen, and servants whose livelihoods were tied to this new religious regime. For a brief moment, Akhetaten became the main stage of Egyptian political and spiritual life, and then, almost as quickly, it ended. After Akhenaten's death, later rulers abandoned the city. Temples were dismantled, building blocks reused elsewhere. The desert slowly reclaimed the rest. What survives now is a frozen snapshot, an entire royal city that lived and died within a few decades, its ruins still whispering about how tightly pharaonic ideology and urban life could be intertwined. Beneath all of these cities, Memphis, Thebes, Akhetaten, and countless lesser-known towns, the Nile kept dictating the rules. Because of the annual flood, Egyptians didn't need to build massive irrigation works on the same scale as Mesopotamia. The river did much of the heavy lifting. Instead, they developed basin irrigation, embankments and channels that guided the floodwaters into fields and then let them drain away, leaving behind a perfectly moistened, fertilized seedbed. This rhythm shaped everything. Agricultural labor was highly seasonal. During the flood, when the fields were underwater, farmers were often available for other work, repairing canals, building temples, hauling stone for pyramids or royal tombs. Pharaohs could mobilize this surplus labor, but it wasn't always a matter of dragging people away from their farms. Often, the agricultural cycle itself created windows of time when large-scale projects were possible. Urban planning too was adapted to the river's pulse. Houses were built of mud brick, easy to remake after damage. Town layouts had to remain flexible, able to shift as the fertile land crept or retreated with changes in flood patterns. Storage facilities, granaries and silos were crucial, acting as buffers between good years and bad ones, and often controlled by temples or the state. In this world, pharaonic power and urban development were in constant conversation. The king claimed to guarantee the flood's reliability through proper rituals and justice. Temples and palaces concentrated wealth and labor, turning agricultural surplus into stone monuments and administrative apparatus. Cities in turn housed the scribes who recorded harvests, the craftsmen who fashioned offerings, the priests who managed the gods' estates, and the workers who built the tombs and temples that made pharaonic divinity visible. But if you walk through those cities day by day, you wouldn't see cosmic order so much as human improvisation. In Memphis, market stalls would have lined busy streets near the harbour, trading grain, beer, linen, and imported luxuries from the Levant and beyond. In Thebes, ferries would have shuttled constantly across the river, carrying priests to temples, workers to tombs, families visiting relatives on the opposite bank. In Akhetaten, officials would have hurried along the broad processional roads while children chased each other through narrower alleys behind the grand facades. And in Deir el-Medina, after a long day in the tombs, craftsmen would come home to small courtyards, share beer and bread, gossip about their overseers, tell stories about the pharaohs whose names they carved in gold and blue on tomb walls, and then go to sleep in houses that, unlike the royal monuments, were never meant to last forever. In the end, Egypt's monuments survived. Its cities mostly did not. But when archaeologists sift through collapsed mud brick, when they translate the informal notes of a scribe complaining about late rations, or trace the pattern of streets buried under centuries of silt, a different Egypt emerges. Not just a land of pyramids and gods, but a long, narrow world of towns and villages, of experiments in organizing labor and belief along a river that rose and fell with clockwork regularity, a place where cities grew in the shadow of monuments, and where, behind the stone faces of pharaohs, ordinary people quietly invented ways of living together that would echo, in different forms, through every urban experiment that followed. Now, shift the map in your mind. Move your attention away from Mesopotamia's ziggurats and Egypt's stone horizons. Let the Nile fade. Let the Tigris and Euphrates slip into darkness. The story of cities did not begin and end there. While scribes in Ur were pressing reeds into wet clay, while pyramid foundations were being levelled along the Nile, other landscapes were quietly, almost secretly, conducting their own experiments in urban life. No single blueprint, no central committee, just humans in very different environments, reaching for similar solutions in their own strange ways. Let's start far to the east. You're standing on the banks of a restless river, thick with yellow silt. The Yellow River in northern China has always been unpredictable. It floods without warning, changing course, dumping layers of fertile but dangerous mud across the plains. To live here, your ancestors had to learn to cooperate or be washed away. Thousands of years ago, long before the Qin emperors, before the Great Wall, the people of this river valley were already building something new. Archaeologists call one of their early centres Erlitou. We don't know what its people called it. We don't even know for sure what kind of political system they had. Later Chinese texts speak of a legendary Xia dynasty around this time, but the ruins themselves are silent. What we do have is the shape of the city. Picture it in the dim twilight. A planned settlement spreading across the landscape, perhaps 2 to 3 square kilometres at its peak. Wide rammed earth foundations suggesting palaces or administrative halls. Neatly laid out workshops where bronze was cast in standardised moulds. Early roadways and drainage systems that hint at collective planning. Storage facilities that may have held grain, tribute or raw materials. Unlike Çatalhöyük, where houses were piled together like honeycombs, Erlitou has something cities hadn't quite shown before. Clear internal zoning. Some areas reserved for elites or ritual, others for production, others for living. Not yet the immense walled capitals of later Chinese dynasties, but not a village either. More like a prototype. From the air, if you could float above it in the quiet night, you'd see straight lines and rectangular courtyards, the faint geometry of authority starting to press itself onto the landscape. Bronze bells, ritual vessels, jade ornaments, objects that don't feed you, don't clothe you, but tell everyone who holds power and who does not. Here, urban life seems to be growing out of a tangle of things at once. Control of bronze technology, management of river floods and irrigation, emerging ritual hierarchies. A city is a place where metal, water and belief come together around a small group of people who can coordinate it all, or at least claim that they can. Now, fade that scene out. Slide your mind across the Pacific, across empty waves, long before these oceans carried ships and gunpowder and empires. Somewhere on the coast of what is now Peru, listen to another shore, another river valley, another experiment. Caral Soup. You wouldn't recognize it as a city, not at first. There are no clay tablets, no pottery jars stacked in storerooms, no evidence of armies or defensive walls. If you walked there 4,600 or 5,000 years ago, you'd see something oddly peaceful. In the moonlight, 6 large platform mounds rise from the desert floor, not pyramids with sharp peaks, but broad terraced structures. Around them, sunken circular plazas, staircases climbing up their flanks, simple houses scattered around the ceremonial core. From above, it looks like architecture that grew out of music and ritual rather than war. And here is the puzzle. Caral Soup was monumental. It required huge amounts of labour, planning and coordination. Yet archaeologists find almost no signs of warfare. No fortification walls. No mass graves of violent conflict. No smashed monuments. Even stranger, all of this blossomed in a culture that didn't yet use pottery. You can pause there, let that sink in. A society capable of organising thousands of people to build massive stone and earth platforms, but still cooking in baskets, gourds and pits instead of fired clay bowls. A society that invested in public architecture and ceremonial spaces, but didn't leave us written records or looming statues of kings. So what drew people into this proto-city? Evidence suggests it might have been trade and ritual. The people of Caral seem to have controlled cotton fields along the river. Cotton may not sound impressive in the dark, but in a world of fishing nets, it was power. They could trade finely made nets to coastal communities who harvested anchovies and other fish, then bring those dried fish inland as food. Cotton for nets, nets for fish, fish for inland farmers. A triangle of reciprocity. The monumental plazas at Caral might have been gathering places where different communities met regularly to reaffirm the system. Music, feasting, and ritual could have been the glue that held a far-flung network together, a city not built on the backs of soldiers or even bureaucrats, but on the rhythms of trade winds and shared ceremonies, different from Mesopotamia, different from Erlitou, yet still unmistakably an early city. Now trace another line in your imagination, north, into the forests and coasts of Mesoamerica. Long before the Maya raised their stepped pyramids, before Teotihuacan's Avenue of the Dead, there were the Olmec. The Olmec heartland lay in the swampy, fertile lowlands of what is now southern Mexico. When you first hear about them, one image stands out. Enormous carved heads, each weighing several tons, with calm, heavy-lidded faces and helmets that might be part of a ritual costume, or maybe something else entirely. Where did you put statues like that? In places that were more than villages. Centres like San Lorenzo and La Venta weren't cities in the modern sense, crowded with stone houses and narrow lanes, but they were organised nodes of population, labour and ritual. San Lorenzo sits on a plateau that was reshaped by human hands, terraces cut, platforms arranged, drainage systems carved into the earth. La Venta offers a carefully oriented ceremonial core, with pyramid-like mounds, plazas, and buried offerings of jade and serpentine. These places gathered people from scores of nearby communities. They concentrated artisans, rulers, and probably some kind of ritual specialists. Goods flowed in: obsidian, jade, cacao, rubber, exotic shells, and symbolic objects flowed out. Masks, figurines, and those immense stone heads. Urban life here seems to pulse with religion and spectacle. Maybe trade supported it. Maybe control over rare materials did. But what planted these centres on the landscape was more than economics. The entire arrangement suggests cosmology, a belief about how the world is ordered and where humans fit within it. The Olmecs show us that you can get very far toward urban complexity without looking anything like Ur or Memphis. No cuneiform tablets, no papyrus scrolls, different gods, different soils, different crops. Yet still, clustered human life, structured space, monumental building, long-distance exchange, independent, parallel, uneasily familiar, shift again. Head back across the Atlantic, but this time pause not in Mesopotamia, not along the Nile, but slightly south, into a region historians long treated as a side note: Nubia, the Kingdom of Kerma. For much of modern scholarship, African urbanism outside of Egypt was almost invisible. It sat there in the archaeological record, overlooked, half acknowledged, as if civilization needed stone pyramids to count. But recent work has been pulling the curtain back. Kerma, in what is now Sudan, grew up along the Nile just as Egypt did, but it had its own trajectory, its own centres, its own version of urban life. Picture a city where the desert meets the river. Mud brick buildings cluster around a massive multi-story structure archaeologists call a defufa. Thick walls, internal chambers, perhaps serving as temple, palace, or some combination of both. Around it, neighbourhoods spread out. Houses, workshops, storage facilities. Kerma wasn't a satellite of Egypt. At its height, it was a rival. It controlled trade routes that carried gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals north toward the Egyptian court. It minted its own styles of pottery, built its own monumental tombs, and developed its own political institutions. Some of its royal burials are surrounded by dozens, even hundreds, of human and animal sacrifices, a dark, unsettling reminder that complexity does not always mean gentleness. Yet, like other early cities, Kerma also depends on cooperation, irrigation, and shared infrastructure. Dikes and basins capture the Nile's annual flood. Fields are laid out and maintained. Artisans craft goods for local use and export. Traders move between river and desert. The city is a knot where environmental control, trade, and power are tied together. So now, if you zoom out, far out, you can see them all at once. Erletu on its yellow plains, Caral Soup in its misty coastal valleys, Olmec's centres in their humid swamps, Kerma along the desert river, Indus cities on their baked floodplains, Mesopotamian tells rising from their alluvial mud, Egyptian towns in the shadow of stone. They are not copies of each other. There was no ancient Zoom call where city planners compared notes. Urban life, it seems, was invented again and again. What does that tell us about human nature? One tempting answer is inevitability. Put enough people in one place, give them agriculture and a few thousand years, and cities will emerge like mould in a damp corner. But the archaeological record suggests something more subtle. Not every farming society became urban. Some remained village-based for millennia and did just fine. Others built ceremonial centres and then abandoned them. Urbanism was not a guaranteed next stage. Like a video game level you unlock automatically after inventing irrigation. It was a choice, or rather, a series of choices made by many people over long spans of time. In some regions, cities seem to grow out of trade. Caral Soup's cotton and fish exchange. Kerma's role as a node in long-distance routes. Certain coastal and riverine centres in China where bronze, salt or jade moved in and out like tides. In other places, religion seems to be the main driver. Göbekli Tepe's carved pillars on a Turkish hillside. Olmec's ceremonial centres arranged as earthly diagrams of the cosmos. The Defufa at Kerma towering over its neighbourhoods. Urban space as a stage built primarily for gods, ancestors, and rituals that pull scattered communities into a single orbit. Elsewhere, agriculture and resource management lie at the centre. Erletu and the harnessing of the Yellow River. Indus cities with their carefully laid out granaries and standardised bricks. Places where the need to coordinate water, fields and labour leads, step by step, to something that begins to look like a city. And sometimes it's all of these at once. Trade networks that require meeting points. Ritual systems that need permanent sacred architecture. Irrigation works that demand repair crews, overseers and schedules. As these strands twist together, you get dense nodes of people and infrastructure. You get streets, plazas, storage rooms, archives, neighbourhoods, and social roles that no longer fit into a simple village. Different environments, different crops, different gods, different languages, yet certain threads repeat. Monumental architecture, even if it's humble mud brick instead of carved stone. Specialised labour, artisans, priests, traders, scribes, or their local equivalents. Long-distance exchange that brings in goods from beyond the horizon. Some form of hierarchy, though it can be soft and negotiable, or sharp and brutal. And above all, a web of stories, myths, rituals, promises, that convince large numbers of people to keep cooperating with people they don't know personally. Beneath the details, you can feel something about us as a species. We are drawn to clustering, to building shared spaces that are bigger than any one family could need, to creating centres, places where meaning, goods and power accumulate. But we're also endlessly inventive in how we do it. Some cities lean heavily on bureaucracy and record-keeping, others on feasts and processions, some on control of metal, others on control of water, others on control of symbols. Urbanism is not a single invention, like the wheel. It's more like fire. Discovered, rediscovered, nurtured, forgotten and sparked again in different hearths around the world. And if you listen carefully, beneath the rustle of reeds on the Yellow River, the pounding surf of the Peruvian coast, the insects humming in Olmec swamps, the wind over Nubian sands, you can almost hear the same quiet, stubborn question being asked over and over. How big can human cooperation get before it breaks? The first cities were some of our earliest answers, not the final ones, just experiments. Some lasted for centuries, some for millennia, some collapsed and blew away as dust. But each parallel attempt widened the range of what human life could look like. Soon, though, as these experiments multiplied, something else began to appear in their shadows. New forms of inequality, new ways of organizing violence, new vulnerabilities that came with density and dependence. Cities gave us possibilities. They also came with a cost. And to see that cost clearly, we have to step inside the darker rooms of the early urban world. By the time the first true cities appeared, humans had already survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and planetary near misses. We had crossed continents, outlasted predators, and turned the most hostile environments into home. But nothing we had faced prepared us for what we were about to do to ourselves. Because when people gathered in permanent dense settlements, something strange happened. For the first time in our history, the main threat to human life wasn't saber-toothed cats, or sudden droughts, or collapsing ice sheets. It was other humans, our waste, our crowding, our systems. Cities did not just transform how we lived, they transformed how we died. Imagine walking through one of the earliest true cities, maybe Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, maybe Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, maybe one of the early Nile towns hugged tight to the river. You weave through narrow lanes between mud brick walls. The air is thick, smoke from hearths, the smell of animals, the sour stench of waste slowly evaporating in the sun. The city feels alive, but underneath the streets, in quiet burial grounds and forgotten corners, another story is written. Archaeologists read it in bone. They open a grave and lift out a skeleton. The teeth are scarred with deep lines, the signature of childhood malnutrition. Growth was interrupted, maybe again and again, during times when food ran short or disease raged. The leg bones show signs of stunted growth, the spine tiny fractures from heavy loads carried too young. Many skeletons from the earliest urban layers are short, underdeveloped compared to their rural neighbours. In some early farming villages, people seem surprisingly robust. But in the first dense cities, average lifespans often drop. In cemetery after cemetery, most of the dead are children and young adults. Very few reach old age. You can almost see the pattern playing out. In a small, mobile band of hunter-gatherers, a disease burns through fast. There are not enough hosts to keep it going. The group moves, the pathogen dies out. In a city, people are packed together, sharing water, air, food, parasites. Disease doesn't flare. It settles in. In ancient Mesopotamian cities, skeletal remains show healed infections, chronic sinus problems, spinal diseases, conditions linked to dense living, smoke, and poor sanitation. In the Indus cities, drains and sewage channels hint at just how serious a problem waste had become. You don't design kilometre-long drainage networks unless you're fighting something persistent. Urban life created what some historians call health catastrophe. Not instantly, not everywhere, and not for everyone, but as a pattern. Shorter lives, more disease, more child deaths, and yet people kept coming. They came because cities offered something else: safety from raiders, access to trade, ritual, status, stories. But the price was high. Think about what density really means for disease. Bodies close together mean pathogens have a constant chain of new hosts. Once cities reach a certain size, they can sustain crowd diseases, measles-like, flu-like gastrointestinal infections that would simply vanish in a scattered mobile population. We don't know exactly when many of the classic urban diseases emerged. Bacteria and viruses do not fossilize, but the pattern is clear. The larger and more permanent the settlement, the richer the ecological playground for microbes. Filthy streets, standing water, animals penned in courtyards, grain stored in bulk with mice and insects tunneling through it. Each of these adds another layer to the microbial city hidden within the human city. In some early graveyards you see hints of epidemics, many deaths clustered in the same year, the same season, the same layer of soil, children and adults together buried hastily, skeletons with lesions that look like tuberculosis or brucellosis or other slow killers. In a mobile world, the worst disasters came from outside: a drought, a failed migration, a predator. In a city, the worst disasters often came from within, from water you drank yesterday, from food your neighbour handled, from the breath of the stranger sleeping on the other side of the wall. And yet, the story of cities is not only about bodies breaking down, it is about social structures hardening. Before cities, inequality certainly existed. Some individuals had more influence, more followers, more mates, better tools. But it was flexible. Leaders could be abandoned. Habitual bullies could be exiled or killed. Mobility was a weapon against domination. When people locked themselves to land and buildings, when they invested labour into walls, fields, canals and houses that could not be easily moved, mobility faded, and inequality found its anchor. In the archaeological record of early cities, you start to see clear, systematic differences in how people lived and died. On one side of town, large houses, sometimes with many rooms and courtyards, storage jars full of grain, imported goods, exotic stones, finely made pottery, in some graves, jewellery, weapons, ornate figurines. On the other side, tiny one-room dwellings, walls built from reused bricks, floors repatched again and again, burials with almost no grave goods, sometimes even stacked together in ways that suggest cramped, marginal living. In some Mesopotamian cities, elite compounds are raised above surrounding neighbourhoods, literally looking down on the lower quarters. In early Egyptian towns, certain districts are tightly organised around temples and palaces, while others are crowded, irregular, almost improvisational. Inequality stops being a temporary imbalance and becomes an architecture. You can see it in street plans, in house size, in diet. Chemical analysis of bones from early urban cemeteries sometimes shows that one group of people ate more meat, more diverse foods, or had more consistent access to high-status items like certain fish or exotic imports. Another group depended almost entirely on cereal grains, with nutrient deficiencies etched into their skeletons. Poverty in the modern sense has roots here. Not just having less, but being systematically prevented from having more, in tribute, in tax, in debt. Early clay tablets from Mesopotamia mention people who owe silver or owe grain to temple or palace institutions. When they cannot pay, they can be seized, or their children taken as bond labour. Debt becomes a mechanism for pulling people into permanent subordination, and beneath that even darker currents stir, because inequality on this scale almost always rests on coerced work. Forced labour is written into the bones of the early city. In Egypt, long lines of figures carved on tomb walls show workers hauling massive stones, making bricks, digging canals. Official inscriptions describe corvée, labour, seasonal, obligatory work for the state, often enforced with lashes and overseers. These might have been peasants drafted for part of the year, but they had little choice. In Mesopotamia, tablets refer to male and female slaves, allocated to temples, palaces, and private households. Some are clearly war captives, taken in raids or campaigns. Others appear to have been sold because of debt or famine. In the Indus Valley, the picture is murkier. We do not yet have deciphered text mentioning slaves, but we see massive public works, kilns, drains, platforms, requiring organized, repetitive, physically punishing labor. Someone mixed those bricks, carried those loads, stood for hours in smoke and heat. The marks show up in skeletons, damaged vertebrae from heavy lifting, degenerative joint disease in young adults, repetitive stress injuries in shoulders and knees, people whose bodies were used up doing someone else's work. Slavery, forced labor, coercion, these do not begin with cities, but cities amplify them. They make them systemic, record them in writing, embed them in law. You can no longer just walk away from a bad arrangement when your home, your fields, your ancestors' graves, and your debts all tie you to a single place. The city holds you, and the city itself begins to devour its surroundings. Early urban centres were like stars pulling matter into their orbit. People flowed in, so did resources. Wood for fuel and construction, stone for tools and monuments, clay for bricks, reeds, fodder, and above all water and soil fertility. In southern Mesopotamia, cities like Uruk and Ur depended on irrigation. Canals snaked across the floodplain, bringing river water to fields of wheat and barley. For a while this system worked brilliantly. Yields soared, populations grew, but irrigation in a hot, flat landscape carries a hidden cost: salt. As water evaporates from the soil, dissolved salts are left behind. Unless fields are periodically flushed with fresh water or given time to rest, salt slowly builds up. Crop yields decline. Some early Mesopotamian texts lament fields that have turned white, a poetic way of describing salinization. Over centuries, this process may have undermined the very agricultural base that fed the first cities. In other regions, the pattern is deforestation. To build houses, boats, city walls, and to fire endless kilns for pottery and bricks, early urban societies cut down trees around them. Pollen records from lake sediments near some ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean sites show sudden shifts. Forest species disappear, replaced by scrub and erosion-tolerant plants. In hilly areas, once the trees are gone, rain starts carrying soil away. Hills turn to bare rock, springs dry up. The city lives by converting complex ecosystems into simplified, managed zones: fields, pastures, orchards, quarries. For a while, the conversion looks like progress. Then, often, the land begins to fail. Collapse does not always mean dramatic ruin. Sometimes it looks like slow hollowing out. Fewer people, poorer diets, abandoned neighbourhoods, crumbling drains no one bothers to repair. The bright experiment of urban life flickers. And beneath all this, the disease, the inequality, the coerced labour, the environmental stress, there is something more difficult to see in artefacts and bones: the inner cost. For most of our species' history, people lived in groups where everybody knew everybody else. A band of a few dozen, a village of 100, a web of related camps. Faces were familiar, histories were shared. If you met a stranger, it meant something important: a new ally, a new rival, a potential mate. In cities, this changes. You can walk through an early urban street and pass dozens, even hundreds of people you have never met and will never see again. They are not kin, not allies, not enemies. They are just there. This anonymity is powerful. It allows new kinds of freedom. You can reinvent yourself, escape a reputation, think thoughts no one around you understands. But it also allows new kinds of loneliness. We cannot interview the residents of Çatalhöyük or Rewrote or Mohenjo-Daro about their feelings, but hints appear. In some early urban houses, walls are covered with repeated symbols, marks, and images, as if people were trying to create small islands of meaning in crowded, impersonal environments. In burial grounds, we start seeing individuals buried alone, separate from family clusters, or with objects that seem intensely personal. Small figurines, amulets, carefully repaired tools. We also see the rise of what looks like social stress. Crowded neighborhoods rebuilt again and again after fires or collapses, evidence of interpersonal violence, broken noses, healed skull fractures, defensive wounds on forearms. People living in close quarters, under pressure, sometimes turning that pressure on each other. Stories from later city civilizations, myths, laments, wisdom texts speak of alienation, injustice, and fear inside the urban walls. Poets in Mesopotamia complain of corrupt judges and hungry crowds. Egyptian texts describe a city turned upside down, where the poor envy the rich and the streets are unsafe. The psychological effects of being one tiny part of something so big and impersonal were likely profound, even if we can only glimpse them from a distance. And yet, people stayed. They stayed in cities that made them sicker. They stayed in systems that made them poorer. They stayed in landscapes that were slowly wearing out. Why? Because by the time cities truly took hold, many people no longer had a real choice. Once your food comes from fields controlled by temples or elites, leaving means risking starvation. Once your rights are written into laws that apply only within the city's jurisdiction, moving away means losing protection. If your craft, your skills, your identity are tied to urban networks, if you are a potter whose wares are sold through city markets, a scribe whose knowledge only matters in a bureaucracy, a priest whose rituals require a temple, where do you go? Cities create dependency. They offer safety from raiders behind walls, but only if you stay inside. They offer grain from central stores during a bad harvest, but only to those registered in their systems. They offer rituals, festivals, prestige, written contracts, and the promise, just the promise of upward mobility. They also generate fear of being expelled, of being cut off, of falling to the bottom of an increasingly steep social pyramid. So people remained. They had made a bargain, most without ever choosing it consciously, in exchange for security, for access to goods and ideas and community on a scale never seen before. They accepted new vulnerabilities and new forms of control. They traded the risks of the wild for the risks of the crowd. They traded the freedom of movement for the stability of walls. They traded a world where danger came from nature for one where danger came from systems they themselves had built. The first cities were astonishing achievements of human imagination and cooperation. They were also traps, not in a simple villainous sense, but in a deeper evolutionary one. Once enough people stepped into this new pattern of living, once enough resources and memories and stories anchored themselves to brick and stone, it became very hard to step back out. We still live inside that bargain. But before we decide whether it was worth it, we need to look at the other side of the story, the ways cities also expanded what humans could be, the alternatives they almost took, and the paths we may still not fully understand. By now, the story of how cities began might feel slippery. The neat diagrams you saw in school, little arrows marching from foragers to farmers to villages to cities to states, start to look less like history and more like a comforting bedtime story we told ourselves. In this part of the night, as everything grows quieter and slower, we step back and look at the pattern from far above. What if almost everything we thought we knew about the birth of cities is wrong, or at least too simple to be useful? For more than a century, archaeologists and historians repeated a basic idea. Cities required agriculture. They required kings, or something very much like them. You needed full-time rulers, priests, and bureaucrats to organize irrigation, collect taxes, run armies, and manage markets. Only then, we were told, could you get real urban life. Then Göbekli Tepe appeared, rising out of the dust of southeastern Turkey like a ghost from another timeline, and that story began to unravel. Enormous stone pillars, elaborate carvings, large gatherings, monumental architecture, but no sign of permanent fields, no streets, no palace, no king. People who, by all appearances, were still foragers, were building something that looked a lot like the ritual heart of a city. Not a market city, not a bureaucratic city, but a place that pulled hundreds of people together to cooperate on projects that would have taken years, even decades. The old narrative cracked. It cracked again with Çatalhöyük, an enormous settlement with thousands of people, no central temple towering above the rest, no clear palace, no monumental walls, a city without streets, a city without obvious rulers. The more archaeologists dug, the stranger the story became. It started looking less like a straight line and more like a tangle of experiments. Some places had big walls before they had big temples. Some had temples before they had kings. Some had kings without much in the way of monumental architecture. Others had dense populations and long-distance trade, and still no sign of rigid hierarchy. The simple narrative collapsed. Instead of cities required kings, we get something softer but more interesting. Cities required ways of organizing large groups of people, ways of sharing space, labor, stories, and resources. Sometimes that meant kings. Sometimes it meant elders, or councils, or rotating leadership, or arrangements we haven't even imagined yet. The idea that agriculture had to come first is also starting to look shaky. At several early sites, it seems ritual centers, gathering places, came before full-blown farming. People may have gathered to feast and worship, and only later decided it would be easier if some food stayed put with them. Agriculture as an outcome of social and ritual life, not just a technological trigger. It doesn't mean the old story was entirely wrong. It means it was incomplete. It was drawn from a tiny sample of evidence, sorted through a particular lens, at a particular moment in history. Now, new lenses are being used. One of the most powerful comes from feminist archaeology. For a long time, interpretations of early cities were filtered through a quiet assumption. Men hunted, men ruled, men made the decisions that mattered. Women were background, caregivers, passive. The trowels were in the ground, but the imaginations behind them were carrying 19th and 20th century gender roles into the deep past. Feminist archaeologists began asking different questions. When we find weaving tools, grinding stones, cooking hearths, figurines, traces of pigments, who do we assume used them, and why? When we see houses built in clusters with shared courtyards and cooking spaces, do we automatically imagine patriarchs in charge? Or could these be networks of sisters, mothers, aunts, grandmothers? Looking again at Çatalhöyük, some researchers notice something striking. Burials of men and women look remarkably similar. Grave goods are not dramatically skewed toward one sex. Artistic depictions seem to show both male and female forms, animal-human hybrids, fluid imagery rather than rigid hierarchies of gender. In some early Mesopotamian records, we glimpse women as property owners, priestesses, traders. In the Indus cities, the lack of big palaces and royal tombs has led some scholars to wonder whether power, including gendered power, was distributed in ways we don't yet recognize. None of this proves that early cities were gender egalitarian utopias, but it destabilizes the lazy assumption that patriarchy is as old as urban life itself. It hints at possibilities. It reminds us that households, kin groups, and neighborhoods may have been shaped as much by women's choices and labor as by the decisions of male elites. If you change who you think is in the story changes. Another new lens comes from a very different direction: political economy. In particular, a theory you might hear called the grain and states theory. Look at where many early states formed. Floodplains of wheat and barley in Mesopotamia, millet and later wheat in North China, rice and millet in parts of East Asia. Grains that can be measured, stored, taxed. Grains that ripen at the same time in fields you can count. Some scholars argue that early states were, at their core, elaborate protection rackets built around these grains. Imagine it. You grow barley. You use irrigation canals that cross your neighbour's fields. Somewhere an official appears. Maybe he calls himself a king. Maybe he speaks for a god. He says, "We will protect the canals. We will protect you from raids. We will ensure the harvest. In return, you owe us a portion of your grain." The grain is easy to see, easy to count, easy to confiscate if necessary. A system emerges, scribes to track who owes what, soldiers to enforce collection, priests to announce ritual justifications, bureaucrats to manage storage and distribution. From one perspective, this is civilization: roads, irrigation, temples, writing. From another, it is organized extraction, layered over a basic reality. You must pay to exist safely inside the system. If you refuse, life becomes hard, very hard. In this view, many early cities tied to states were not just centers of culture and trade, they were also hubs where surplus was siphoned off and redirected toward elites, toward armies, toward monuments that glorified the system itself. But not all cities fit this pattern. Göbekli Tepe is older than most of these grain states. Çatalhöyük, despite evidence of some farming, does not show the familiar fingerprints of a tax-collecting bureaucratic apparatus. The Indus cities, with their standardized bricks and carefully laid drains, do not scream royal tax office, at least not in any way we can yet detect. They may represent alternative social arrangements that flourished before, alongside and even after hierarchical states emerged. Think of cities held together not by standing armies, but by shared rituals, shared neighborhood obligations, rotating responsibilities, extensive kin networks, and mutual aid. Think of settlements where decisions were made in assemblies, or staged through seasonal councils, or negotiated at the level of clan elders and household heads rather than a single royal centre. Think of urban life where the most imposing structures were not palaces, but granaries, council houses, communal shrines, or simply the crowded pattern of homes themselves. Even in Mesopotamia, where kings and temples loom large, we see hints of other arrangements. Periods where centralized authority weakens and smaller towns thrive. Documents that show ordinary people buying and selling land, making contracts, suing one another, navigating the system rather than being swallowed entirely by it. Archaeology, increasingly, reveals a long prehistory of political experimentation. There were cities that seem highly stratified, huge tombs, rich graves, palaces, clear lines of command. There were cities where hierarchy is almost painfully obvious. But there were also cities where status differences, if they existed, left lighter traces, where houses are similar in size, where burials are modest, where the main monument is infrastructure used by everyone, wells, drains, roads, walls. These are reminders that hierarchy, at the scale we often take for granted today, is not an automatic consequence of people living together. It is one option among many. And that might be the most unsettling lesson of all. The first cities teach us that human possibilities were, and still are, much wider than the narrow band of arrangements we've come to think of as normal. If early people could build dense, long-lived settlements without obvious kings, if they could maintain large-scale trade and shared standards like brick sizes and weights without a single central ruler, if they could create monumental ritual spaces before they had full-time farmers, then hierarchy, strong as it is not destiny. It may be efficient under certain conditions. It may be resilient in particular environments. It may even at times feel inevitable from the inside. But the archaeological record quietly insists humans have tried other ways. They have lived in cities that look less like empires and more like sprawling, complicated neighborhoods. They have organized themselves around rituals instead of rulers, around kinship instead of kingship, around squares and shrines instead of thrones. As you listen in the dark, you can almost hear the hum of those other possibilities still echoing. Part of why these echoes grow louder now is that archaeologists keep finding new things, and old things keep revealing new secrets. Ground-penetrating radar uncovers buried streets beneath modern towns. Satellite imagery traces the ghost outlines of forgotten walls and canals. Micro-remains of plants and animals in ancient soils tell us who was eating what and when. Ancient DNA from teeth and bones shows who moved where, who married whom, who brought new ideas and skills along trade routes no one suspected. Every year there are surprises. A city discovered under jungle canopy, its grid still faintly visible. A temple complex older than expected, evidence of early water management in places thought too marginal. Clay tablets that don't record royal boasts, but debt cancellations, legal disputes, lists of workers paid in grain. Each find tugs at the web of assumptions we've woven around urban origins. And yet, some of the most important questions remain stubbornly unanswered. We still do not know exactly how people at Çatalhöyük made decisions together. Was there a council of elders? Did some families quietly accumulate more influence, even if their houses look the same from the outside? We don't know what language was spoken in the Indus cities, or how their political system actually worked. Was there a ruling council? Rotating leadership tied to guilds or lineages? Something we have no modern analogy for at all. We do not know how ordinary women in early cities experienced daily life. Were they relatively free to move, trade, own property, or were they constrained in ways the bones and bricks cannot clearly show? We do not know how many times egalitarian or semi-egalitarian cities rose, flourished for centuries, and then vanished, leaving barely a trace under river sediment or desert sand. We do not know exactly why some cities turned toward increasingly rigid hierarchy while others did not, or why some bounced back and forth between stronger and weaker forms of centralized power across centuries. We may never fully answer these questions. The evidence is fragmentary. Organic materials rot, languages disappear, entire neighborhoods lie beneath modern cities we cannot simply tear down to look at the soil beneath. But uncertainty is not a failure. It is an opening. It allows us to see early cities not as fixed templates we're doomed to repeat, but as experiments in being human together. Some experiments concentrated power and called it divine. Others spread power thinly and embedded it in rituals, customs, and shared infrastructure. Some organized around grain, others around herds or trade routes, or sacred sites visited at certain times of year. All of them were provisional, fragile, contingent. So are ours. As you drift towards sleep, you can imagine those first city dwellers, lying in their crowded rooms, listening to the sounds of their own nights, fires crackling on rooftops, animals shifting in pens, distant drums from a shrine, the murmur of neighbors through mud-brick walls. They did not know they were inventing cities. They were just trying to live, to make meaning, to manage conflict, to balance cooperation and competition. They tried one arrangement, then another, then another. In their experiments are clues to what we still might become. So now, at the end of this long, quiet journey, try to hold all of it in your mind at once. The tiny Ice Age bands huddled around flickering fires, the seasonal gathering places where people came together not to obey a king, but to see old friends, trade stories, and remember their dead. The temple on the hill at Göbekli Tepe, rising out of the stone like a question mark. The dense, roof-linked homes of Çatalhöyük, a city with no streets and no obvious rulers. The rigid, channeled landscapes of Mesopotamia, where irrigation ditches and clay tablets began to lock people into hierarchies. The carefully planned, almost eerily orderly cities of the Indus Valley, with their quiet, undeciphered script. The Nile towns beneath the shadow of pyramids, the cities of China, the gridded plazas of the Americas, each one a different answer to the same puzzle. How do you live with thousands of other humans without tearing each other apart? When you look at them this way, the first cities stop being distant, inevitable milestones on a straight road to civilization. They start to look like what they really were, experiments. No one had a blueprint. No one knew how it was supposed to go. People tried things. They gathered first for ritual or for trade or for seasonal feasts. They tried clustering houses together. They tried walls. They tried plazas, temples, granaries, palaces, drainage systems, straight streets, crooked streets, no streets at all. Some of those experiments failed. Cities were abandoned. Rivers changed course. Trade routes shifted. Ruling families collapsed. Entire urban traditions, like those of the Indus, faded so completely that we are still arguing about what language they spoke. Other experiments lasted for centuries, even millennia. But longevity wasn't the only measure of success. Some cities gave people security but demanded obedience. Others allowed surprising degrees of equality, but perhaps at the cost of constant negotiation. Each urban world balanced freedom, order, belief, and survival in a slightly different way. Look closely, and you can see something else. Every one of those early cities was a mirror, reflecting back possibilities that still live inside us. Göbekli Tepe shows how far humans will go, how much effort they will spend not just for food or safety, but for meaning, for stories carved into stone. Çatalhöyük suggests it is possible to pack thousands of people together without obvious kings, without monuments to conquest, and still create a rich, stable life. Mesopotamia shows the power of administration, writing, and law, and the dangers of letting those tools harden into hierarchy so rigid that most lives become invisible. The Indus reminds us that you can build big, complex cities that emphasize sanitation, storage, and standardized weights, while leaving almost no sign of warfare or grandiose rulers. The Nile, the Yellow River, the urban landscapes of Mesoamerica and the Andes each add their own facets. Cities as sacred centers, as cosmic diagrams, as theaters of power, as experiments in planning and control. None of them were inevitable. All of them were choices. When we talk about our own sprawling metropolises, crowded apartment blocks, endless suburbs, glittering financial districts, it can feel like this is simply how things must be. But the archaeological record whispers something very different. It says, humans have tried many ways of living together. We're not stuck with just one. The first cities show that we can design spaces that concentrate care as easily as we concentrate power. That we can choose drainage and public health, or spectacle and inequality, or try to balance both. That cooperation on a massive scale is something our species is very good at. But the stories we attach to that cooperation matter. The people of those early cities were not primitive versions of us. They were us, same brains, same need for belonging, same capacity for kindness and cruelty, for curiosity and fear. They stood at the edge of the unknown and invented urban life from almost nothing. We inherit not just their streets and walls and broken pots, but their unrealized possibilities. So as you drift towards sleep, you might imagine your own city or town or quiet village as just one more chapter in this long experiment. Lights in high-rise windows, late-night buses, murmured conversations through thin walls, all of it connected in a faint, unbroken line back to the first fires on the Ice Age plains and the first stone circles on Anatolian hills. And now, if you're still awake, this is the gentle part where I invite you to stay connected to this journey. If you found this story calming or thought-provoking, you can tap the like button. It helps more people find these late-night histories. You're welcome to subscribe if you'd like to wander through more forgotten cities and deep time with me in the future. I'd also love to hear from you. If you feel like typing a few words before you drift off, tell me where you're listening from. A small apartment in a modern megacity, a quiet house in the countryside, a dorm room, a night shift break room. Together they form a kind of invisible map, another network of humans listening in the dark. If you'd like to support the channel in a more direct way, there is an optional YouTube membership available. It's completely voluntary and simply a way to help me keep making these long, gentle explorations. But watching, listening, and sharing your thoughts in the comments is already more than enough. For now, let the noise of today's world fade a little. Remember that for hundreds of thousands of years, humans have faced uncertainty, gathered together, argued, dreamed, built, and rebuilt. The first cities rose and fell, but the capacity that made them possible, the ability to cooperate, to imagine, to reshape our surroundings, stayed with us. It's still with you, even now in the quiet. Thank you for spending this time here. Let your eyes close, if they haven't already. Let the ancient streets empty, one by one, and allow yourself to rest inside this long ongoing story of human possibility.